All right, folks. Hello and welcome to our July Cocktails and Fishtales. I'm so excited to be here with Kristin Brunk. We're our longtime connection from Alaska, so almost a decade later, this is a fun reunite here and an exciting presentation to talk about what I think is the cutest seabird, the Marbled Murrelet. And some of the ecology and conservation of them. Of course, for those of you tuning in, we always love to know where you're watching from. So if you want to post that in the comments, as well as any questions that you have as we go along, I'll be kind of collecting those questions and fielding them Kristin's way at the end of this presentation. So while we kind of let you get settled in, I always like to ask our presenters to share their favorite cocktail and a wild fish tale. So I'll turn it over to you.
I have been thinking about this since you invited me like months ago to do this. And I don't know if I have a favorite cocktail, but there's one that I've been into lately, which is kind of like a gin mule, except I don't ever have all the ingredients. So it's just gin and ginger beer and lime juice. And I think it's bomb and simple.
Simple and delightful sounding.
I think so. It's very refreshing for the hot summer days like it is here in Wisconsin.
Excellent. And I'm just going to do a shout out for those of you tuning in. Thank you for joining us. It is a beautiful day here in Washington. So thanks for putting a pause on your summertime adventures to come learn and have fun with us. So how about that fishtail?
Yeah, I've also been thinking about this for a while. And I think one of my more interesting fishtales was just after college, one of my very first field jobs was working out on one of the remote Pacific islands, so like off the coast of Hawaii. And I was walking there one day and just doing field work and was suddenly just hit in the head with a fish. And it turned out that I think it was a juvenile booby, a red-footed booby, that had actually vomited the fish onto me while I was walking, which apparently they do when they're getting harassed by frigate birds. So,
well, I've heard that it's good luck if you get pooped on by a bird, but like that must be some extra special luck getting puked on by a bird.
It definitely was an extra special smell.
Yeah. So for those of you tuning in, this is a lucky day for you to be blessed and graced by the honors of someone who's been puked on by a red-footed booby. Like, these are you can't make these things up, folks.
What more can you ask for?
I love it. Well, with no further ado, I just want to remind we have more people tuning in. So if you have questions about this presentation along the way, be sure to type those into the comments so that we can have your questions answered live at the end of the presentation. And I'll go over some upcoming Harbor WildWatch events later at the end as well. So with that, I think we're ready to rock and roll and learn more about the Marbled Murrelet and what people can do to help conserve them. So I'll turn it over to you.
Awesome. Let me share my screen. Can you see that okay?
I can see it.
Awesome. And yeah, I mean, I guess I'll just reiterate real fast. I love when people ask questions. Like I purposely kept this talk a little bit on the shorter side so we have time to like discuss and talk, because I don't really like blathering at people. I really like answering questions and chatting with people. So please ask lots of questions. So yeah, I'm Kristin. I'm a PhD candidate at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, and I'm really excited to be here today to talk about how we can improve conservation by managing people instead of necessarily by managing wildlife. And before I jump into this too far, I wanted to acknowledge that a lot of the work that we do as scientists requires input from lots and lots of people. So there's basically a whole village of people that have helped make this project happen. So I just wanted to acknowledge, especially my co-authors and my advisors, Elena West, Zach Peary, and Anna Pigeon, and also all of the staff and rangers at Big Basin who made this work possible. And then also a ton of undergraduate, like a small army of undergraduate lab technicians that helped me process samples, and for incredible field technicians that I just feel incredibly lucky to have gotten to work with. And then of course, some generous funding sources too. So it takes a village to do a project like this. And yeah, so, okay, with that, let's talk about birds. So this is the marbled murrelet, and marbled murrelets are seabirds, and they're in the family Alcidae, which is the same family as things like puffins and auks and murres, the kind of more traditional seabirds. And you can see that murrelets are kind of pretty small, pretty chunky. They're actually about the size of a robin, so I think sometimes we picture them being bigger than they actually are. They're pretty little. This one on the top is in its breeding plumage, so that nice brown mottled or marbled color, if you will. And this one on the bottom is in their wintering plumage, so it's more of that traditional counter shading that you see in a lot of seabirds with the dark black on top and the white on the bottom, and that helps them camouflage on the ocean when they're sitting on the surface of the water. Murrelet's range is like it runs all the way in the north from the Aleutians down to central California. And what I'm going to talk about today is mostly this very southern chunk of the range. I know a lot of you are probably based in Washington, but I'm going to be talking about a little bit further down south from there at the very southern portion of their range. And so I just think that marbled murrelets have the coolest life history of any seabird, and I'm totally not biased. So like most other seabirds, they spend most of their lives at sea foraging, and they eat small fish like sand lances and squid. But if you do me a favor and picture in your head the type of habitat where you normally imagine a seabird nesting, you're probably picturing a rocky coastline or an island in a large colony with really densely packed birds, and probably everything is covered in bird poop. But that's not what marbled murrelets are about. They actually will nest up to 50 miles inland, high in the branches of old growth forest trees like coast redwoods and especially Douglas firs. And these trees that they're nesting in are usually over 200 years old, sometimes way older than that even, because they need branches to be really, really wide. And marbled murrelets basically make their living when they're on land by not being seen. They have this really cryptic camouflage, so they blend super well into the trees. You can see the brown color there. These birds are basically invisible when they're sitting on their nest. And so usually if we know that a marbled murrelet is in the area, we know it because we heard it calling. And so I just wanted to play for you all what marbled murrelets sound like. So just close your eyes. Imagine you're in the redwood forest with trees towering way over you. And if there's a marbled murrelet around, it's going to sound something like this. Such a beautiful little call. And suddenly there's lots of them. Okay, so marbled murrelets, like I said, they need really wide branches to nest on because they don't actually really construct a nest. They kind of just plop their egg in a little indentation in the moss on those really wide branches. So they need something wide so their egg won't just roll off after they lay it. These guys are so sneaky that we didn't actually find the first nest of the marbled murrelet in North America until 1974. It's one of the very last birds that we discovered where they nest and how they nest, and the whole breeding portion of their life history we had no idea until 1974. And that first nest was actually found in Big Basin Redwoods State Park, which I'm going to talk a lot about tonight. So yeah, marbled murrelets lay one egg per year, just one, but it's a really big egg. So the weight of a marbled murrelet egg is actually similar to the weight of a chicken egg, even though, like I said, a murrelet is about the size of a robin. So there's a ton of energy being invested into that one egg. And just kind of for comparison, in humans, a full-term baby weighs about 5% of the mother when it's born. A murrelet egg weighs 16 to 19% of an adult murrelet. So that's a really big egg. That's a ton of energy that female is putting into making an egg that big. So yeah, the males and females will trade off incubation in 24-hour shifts. Usually one of them will incubate for 24 hours, right? And the other one will then fly in from the ocean before dawn while it's still mostly dark in the forest. And then they'll do a nest switch. The other one will fly off to the ocean and forage for 24 hours and will come back the next morning. So fast forward, they do that for 28 to 30 days, so a whole month for that egg to hatch. And then once it does hatch, the chick stays in the nest, and the parents will usually brood it for 1 or 2 days, but that's pretty much it. After that, the chick is able to thermoregulate, which means keep itself warm and keep itself cool when it needs to. And then at that point, the parents both fly to the ocean, and then they're just foraging and making trips back to the nest as often as they can. And so remember, that's potentially a 50-mile trip one way. The parents are going out to the ocean, bringing one fish back at a time for this little chick in the nest that's waiting, and feeding it as much as they can. So chicks are usually fed between 1 and 8 times a day. And so the adults will do that for 27 to 40 days. And then at that point, this little chick is ready to go. It's a juvenile. And so it just jumps out of its redwood nest 200 feet in the air, flies to the ocean, which it's never seen before. And at that point, it's independent of its parents. Sometimes the juveniles will hang out in little groups of juveniles together, but at that point, they learn to forage on their own. Their parents don't feed them anymore once they get to the ocean. So yeah, just kind of a really incredible journey for a bird of that size and age to be making. And as you can probably imagine, merlets have a really long, slow life history. Adult merlets will live a really long time. They really frequently live over 10 years. Often they live over 20 years, and some of them have lived to be 30, which is really impressive for such a tiny bird. But this dual life history that they live means that they're reliant on both inland habitat, so old growth forests, and marine habitat at sea. And that means that they're susceptible to threats in both of these habitats. At sea, they're at threat from direct mortality from things like being caught in gill nets and oil spills. They're also really susceptible to indirect factors like climate change, which can affect the frequency of El Nino ocean warming events. And generally, El Ninos are really bad for seabirds. Basically, it means the water heats up. There's not as many nutrients up kind of in the shallow waters where birds can get to them. And so there's not fish up there where the birds are foraging. So basically it reduces prey availability for most species of seabirds that we know of. On land, there's a totally different suite of threats for these little guys. So loss of nesting habitat has been a really big one for a really long time. And it's because they live in these old growth forests that are really economically valuable to humans as well. And so because of that, we've logged a lot of their habitat. And specifically in California, where a lot of my work has been done, merlets have lost about 85% of their old growth forest nesting habitat. So that's the bad news. The good news is that what's left of their nesting habitat, at least in Central California, is mostly in protected areas. So then the other limiting factor that we're dealing with, especially in Central California, is low reproductive success, which just means they're basically not able to fledge young as much as we would need them to sustain their populations. And this is largely due, like it says on the slide, to nest predation, specifically by corvids, so birds like crows and ravens and jays. So yeah, these threats altogether have contributed to long-term population declines for the marbled murrelet throughout its range. The latest estimate that I've seen is that they're declining at about 4 to 7% annually, kind of throughout the range. So that's averaged over all of the different places that they live. And 4 to 7% doesn't really sound like that much, but it adds up really, really quickly. So even in Alaska, where numerically there are a lot more murrelets, populations have declined by as much as 50 to 73% over the last 20 years, which is really extreme. So in response to these threats in 1992, the marbled murrelet was listed as federally threatened in Washington, Oregon, and California under the Endangered Species Act. And actually earlier this month, Oregon Fish and Wildlife Commission voted to reclassify the murrelet in Oregon from state threatened to state endangered. So now murrelets are also listed as state endangered in California, Oregon, and Washington. So yeah, there's a lot of folks that are working on a lot of these different aspects and a lot of these different threats to murrelets, especially at sea. But so the work that I'm going to talk about tonight focuses more on these threats on land, and specifically on the second point of low reproductive success. So like I said, a lot of the habitat that's left in California is in protected areas. So really what we're dealing with down here now is this low reproductive success and trying to figure out how we can remedy that. Yeah, so it's great that this habitat is protected, but the issue is that these protected areas are also of really high value to humans for outdoor recreation. And where human recreation and wildlife conservation coincide, there can sometimes be unintended consequences. And we're kind of just really beginning to understand all the impacts that human recreation have on wildlife in protected areas. But the one that I'm going to talk about today involves human food subsidies, which is when wildlife eats human food, as you can see in these pictures on the right. It's really cute, but it's not always great for the wildlife themselves. And so areas that have these really abundant human food subsidies generally have really high densities of species that can take advantage of those resources. So in particular, I'm talking about omnivores that can eat a really wide variety of foods, or in ecology, we call them generalists. And particularly generalist predators that also eat, like a Steller's jay would eat the eggs and the nestlings of other birds. And so other examples of this are animals like squirrels and bears, but also coyotes and raccoons and common ravens. And so when these generalists get these really elevated densities, that can modify how they interact with other species. And in particular, competition and predation are really some interactions that get affected when these generalists attain high densities. And so in some cases, this can lead to what we call spillover predation. And this is when plentiful food resources in one habitat allow predators to achieve these really high densities and spread into other habitats where they can then prey upon species that are already rare. So at the very southernmost part of the Marbled Murrelet's range, the largest remaining tract of old growth forest is protected in Big Basin Redwoods State Park, which is the oldest state park in California. I can't talk enough about how amazing Big Basin is. It was established in 1902. Some of the trees there predate the Roman Empire. It's just an absolutely incredible place to go to. If you haven't been there before, I highly recommend it. But this place also receives over 100,000 visitors per year just to the campgrounds alone. That's not even counting like day use hikers. And so when we go camping, or at least when I go camping, because I love snacks, people usually bring a lot of food with them. And sometimes that can result in a lot of trash at these campsites. And so one generalist predator that's really capitalized on all of these abundant food subsidies is the Steller's jay. And previous work at Big Basin showed that in these campground areas, over half of the jay diet was composed of human foods. And further, jays that were living in these subsidized campground areas and eating lots of human food had high body condition and high fecundity, which basically means they were really fat and they were making a lot of babies. And jay density in campgrounds was 4 times higher than in surrounding forest areas that didn't have the campgrounds and the associated food subsidies. The issue with that is that Steller's jays are also really important nest predators of the Marbled Murrelet. And so these high jay densities and tons of jay babies was really putting murrelets at greater risk from Steller's jays spilling over from campgrounds and into the only nesting habitat left for murrelets. And jay predation of murrelet nests is a pretty big deal. Some population modeling work has shown that reducing corvids, so jay predation, might be the most effective way to recover marbled murrelets. And so with that, I wanted to show this video that I think really does a good job of depicting what it looks like when Steller's jays predate a marbled murrelet nest. So hopefully it'll work again. Here we go. Okay. So here's the murrelet sitting on its nest. You can see they like to choose locations for their nests where there's lots of cover overhead as well. So the nests are really hard to spot. And you could see its little egg underneath it. And here's the big bad Steller's jay. He's basically able to kind of harass the murrelet off the nest, which is pretty not cool. And then have an omelet for breakfast. And that's probably, I'm guessing that's the male that pushed it off the nest. And this looks potentially like the female, probably the pair member that's coming in and being like, hey, give me some of that. Yeah, so that's the problem that we're dealing with. Okay. So we have all these jays here and they're eating a lot of snacks, which is not ideal. There's a lot of kind of management strategies in our wildlife management toolbox to deal with unwanted guests like this. Sometimes we use lethal management strategies, which is a nice way of saying that we could shoot jays and remove them from parks. that strategy, as you can imagine, can be met with some really extreme public backlash. And I think the other really important thing to consider is that Steller's jays are native to redwood forests. So they belong in this system just as much as marbled murrelets do. So if we don't do that, some of the other options, potentially you could selectively remove problematic individuals. So basically that means you capture jays that are known to eat a lot of human foods and you move them somewhere else. This can be challenging. First of all, it can be really hard to catch a jay, which I'm going to talk about in a minute. But also the other really tough part is that jays can fly, which probably you all already knew that. That's pretty basic knowledge, but it just means that when you move them, they might just come right back to the area that you moved them away from. And even if they don't do that, the area might just get colonized by other individuals. So that's not really a great option either. So maybe the simplest solution is just to try to reduce the amount of human food that's available to jays. And so that's what California state parks decided to try to do to reduce the nest predation threat to marbled murrelets. So in 2013, California state parks began the Crumb Clean campaign, which basically aims to reduce human food subsidies to jays and other wildlife using outreach to visitors. So things like I would come give this talk basically at campgrounds pretty frequently. They have a lot of different programs based on marbled murrelets. And then like you can see from these pictures, there's signage everywhere about what the marbled murrelet is and why it's important to protect it. They also improved trash management. So they installed really heavy metal trash cans with really heavy lids that birds couldn't get into. And totally reformed the whole dishwashing procedure for campers at the campgrounds. And then they also enforced these food policies. So the people would walk around, like people at Big Basin would walk around and check campers and make sure that their food was put away and that animals weren't getting into their food. And then the park rangers could actually enforce these policies by writing people tickets and fining them if they weren't keeping their food put away to the appropriate extent. And so we basically wanted to understand if these management efforts had been effective. And so we kind of asked two questions. First of all, can management efforts actually reduce the amount of human food subsidies being eaten by jays? And if so, how do the jay populations actually respond to this reduction of a previously really abundant food resource? And so to answer these questions, we studied Steller's jays at Big Basin during two time periods. So this pre-management period was kind of that early data that I was talking about that showed that jays were eating lots of human food. They were really fat and having lots of babies. And then management began towards the end of 2013, and we let it run for about 3 years. And then from 2017 to 2019, I spent those 3 breeding seasons at Big Basin collecting more data about Steller's jays. And so we measured a lot of different aspects of jay populations, and I'm going to go over this a little bit quickly, but please, please, please ask questions if you're interested in any of these methods. But so we actually measured the amount of human food being consumed by jays using what is called stable isotope analysis. And we conducted stable isotope analysis on feather samples from jays. And the way this works is basically the old adage, you are what you eat, is actually quite literally true. Human foods are often corn-based, so think things like high fructose corn syrup. And corn is a C4 plant, which is a photosynthetic pathway. And so basically these foods are enriched in the heavy isotope of carbon. Whereas more natural food items for jays like insects and nuts and berries are less enriched for that heavy isotope because most of the plants in California that food web is based on are C3 plants. So totally different photosynthetic pathway. So that was a lot of science mumbo jumbo, but basically human foods are largely isotopically distinguishable from natural food sources for Steller's jays. We also collected feather samples and used feather growth bars as a proxy for body condition. And growth bars are light and dark bands that are visible on feathers. And those bands actually represent 24 hours of feather growth. Basically, growing a feather is really energetically costly. I guess I've never done it before, so I can't say from firsthand experience, but from what I hear, it's really energetically costly to grow a feather. And so healthier birds can grow their feathers faster. So basically, wider growth bars equals better body condition. We fit a subset of jays with radio transmitters, and then ran around in the forest tracking them using those big metal antennas that you've probably seen before. And basically tried to understand how home range size, so how much space a bird uses to meet its nutritional needs, and home range overlap, so how much does a bird's home range overlap with its neighbor's home ranges on average, changed between pre and post management periods. And then finally, more simply, maybe we just wanted to understand how many jays there were in these two time periods and how many babies they were having. Also known as density and fecundity. And so to estimate those, we conducted point counts, which basically involve standardized surveys where you go out and count how many jays you see in here and how far from you think they are, which requires some estimation. And then from there, you can estimate how many jays were within that area that you effectively surveyed. So we conducted these point counts in both campgrounds and also in unsubsidized forest areas away from campgrounds so that we could make sure any changes that we found to jay density were specific to those campground areas that were being managed, and hopefully that way due to management rather than just kind of a broad change in jay populations. And then, yeah, finally, to estimate fecundity, we just used a juvenile to adult ratio, which is exactly what it sounds like. It's an estimate of how many juveniles were produced per adult. So you might have noticed that a lot of those metrics that we were measuring require you to have the jay in your hand. So things like taking a feather sample. And so I just wanted to take a minute to talk about catching Steller's jays, because this is, I feel like, the part of the project that people always ask questions about, and it's pretty interesting. So yeah, I thought I would take a minute to talk about jay capture. And I guess, first of all, I'll mention there's a whole mountain of paperwork and a lot of thought involved in getting all of the proper permits and certifications to catch birds in a way that ensures bird safety and research ethics, which is a long-winded way of saying don't try this at home. So yeah, catching jays, as you can imagine, can be really challenging. They're really, really smart. We don't even give them enough credit for how smart they are. And we not only had to catch them once to deploy radio tags at the beginning of the season, but we had to catch the same individuals again at the end of the season, because that's when we wanted to collect all of that information about what they'd been eating all summer. I also, catching them once is not so bad. Catching them twice is really, really hard, because usually, yeah, the first time they're not really hip to what's going on, but the second time they know what's up and they're not interested. So normally to catch birds, kind of the traditional technique is to use what's called a mist net. And so this picture on the left, I think, is a pretty good picture of a mist net. You can see this first pole here. I think you guys can see my mouse. Hopefully you can. So the pole kind of in the middle, and then there's a pole off to the right. And then there's actually a really, really fine mesh net strung between those two poles that's almost invisible. You can kind of see the loops of the net on this pole here. But usually the jays can't see it super well. So we would use a Bluetooth speaker like this one. We would broadcast jay calls, and the jays would be like, who is that I hear in my territory? I need to go check it out and probably kick their butt. And so they would fly in, check out this Bluetooth speaker broadcasting jay calls, and then we would usually kind of run them into the net if possible. That's early in the season when they're still territorial and kind of hopped up on breeding hormones. Later in the season, it's much harder to catch them. They've had their babies, they're not as interested in food. And so sometimes we would get a little bit desperate. At one point, I made this little jay decoy that you can see in the picture on the right. His name is Lucky. He was not very lucky. It didn't work at all. The jays were 0% fooled by this decoy. They were like, that's not a real bird, and we know it. So that didn't work very well. But one thing that we did try that worked kind of well was this kind of little caveman style trap that you see in this one, which actually I made out of a laundry basket. Just modified it a little bit so we could get the birds out once they got in. But yeah, so there's a little pile of peanuts over here on this end of the basket, and then a stick here tied to a string that we were holding the other end of. So once the bird went in, we would pull the string, and actually this is a video, so I'll just play it and y'all can see what it looks like when you catch a jay in a laundry basket. And that's me running to get the bird after it went in the basket. So sometimes you just had to get a little creative and try to mix it up and show them something that they hadn't seen before. So jay capture, not always the easiest. But yeah, once we got the jay, captured, we would carefully extract it from the mist net or the laundry basket. And then we'd carefully work up each individual, which you can see the text here in the middle doing. That's Lake and Jessica working up an individual together. We would gather all the samples that we needed, and then we would also band each bird with a unique combination of colored plastic bands, which you'll see, I think in a couple photos up, there's one that you can see its bands really well. And basically those let us tell who the individuals are without having to recapture them. So from a distance, we can be like, oh, that's Vinny. I can see his violet metal on one side and blue on the other side. Vinny was one of my favorite birds at the park. But yeah, so no birds were ever harmed during this process. Once they were all worked up and banded, you can see this bird on the far right. This guy also got a radio transmitter, so you can see a little bit of the backpack here. Once this bird preens, you won't be able to see that at all, but then you can see the little antenna, so we could always tell who our tagged birds were from a distance. And then after that, we just send them on their merry way, and they run around the park and do their thing while we sometimes chase them occasionally. Yeah, so now that we've talked about capture, I guess we'll talk about some results. So our first big finding was that jay management really reduced the amount of human food that was being eaten by jays, which was really exciting. So this figure shows the isotopic concentrations of 3 diet sources, which we identified for jays. So these are human foods here on the right, or anthropogenic food if you want to get really sciencey and impress your friends. Invertebrates, so insects here on the top left, and then mast, which is plant materials like berries and nuts and acorns, and those things here on the bottom left. And so each of these dots on this figure represents the isotopic concentrations that were measured from one individual jay. So you can see in the pre-management period, these light blue dots, these dots are really shifted over into this anthropogenic food area. Whereas post-management, they're still eating some anthropogenic food, but they've shifted a lot further to the left, which is really exciting. And I think this figure maybe gives kind of a clearer picture. So again, those 3 different diet sources, and then this model basically estimated what proportion of their diet came from each diet source. So in the pre-management period, human foods were making up on average about 88% of a Steller's jay diet, which is totally wild. And post-management, that was down to about 47% of the diet being human food. So how did reduced human food consumption affect jay fitness? It really didn't affect body condition. Growth bars were approximately the same width pre and post-management, which you can see here. There's kind of a lot of overlap in the confidence intervals for these 2 points. So there's not much difference here in the body condition of jays pre and post management, even though they're eating a lot less human food. It was kind of the same story for home range sizes. We found that the amount of space that was used by jays pre and post management was really similar, but where the difference was in how much their home ranges overlapped. So this picture on the left is showing you home ranges for 4 jays. The picture on the right is showing you home ranges for 4 jays. You can see in the pre-management period, some of those home ranges almost completely overlapped. Whereas in the post-management period, there's a lot less overlap between those areas. I think the overlap index that we used was 0.65 pre-management, and then post-management had been reduced to 0.1. So a pretty big difference there in the amount of overlap between home ranges. In terms of density, we actually found a huge difference in campground densities after management, which was really exciting. So the bars that I will call your attention to are these far left ones. Subsidized areas means those campground areas. In pre-management, you can see there were about 4.3-ish jays per hectare, whereas post-management, once food subsidies were reduced, we were seeing less than 1 jay per hectare. So a huge difference. Whereas in those unsubsidized areas, so out in the forest, there was basically no change over the same time period, which helps us kind of figure out that it seems like management is the thing that caused this change, since nothing really changed out here. And it was actually the same story for juvenile densities as well. You can see that kind of jump from 3-ish jays per hectare to less than 1. In the post-management period, and very few juvenile jays were ever detected in those unsubsidized forest areas. Interestingly, though, is in terms of individual fecundity, it didn't really change pre to post-management. So if you think about the fact that we measured, we measured individual fecundity using that juvenile to adult ratio. And so if you remember, since adult densities drastically declined, it means that the number of juveniles produced annually also declined dramatically, even though the per capita fecundity didn't really change much. If you kind of do the math, about 139 juveniles would have been produced annually in the pre-management period, whereas only about 30 would have been produced annually in the post-management period. So per adult, there's still a lot of juveniles being produced, but all together, since there's fewer adults, there's fewer juveniles, if that makes sense. So I threw a bunch of results at you really fast just then, and here's kind of a summary of what we found. Basically, jays were eating less human food. There were fewer jays, there were fewer juveniles, and home range overlap went down quite a bit, whereas body condition and home range size were pretty stable. So this is my graphical representation of what was going on out there. Basically, there were pre-management, there were tons of really buff jays eating lots of human food. Management managed to reduce the amount of human foods that were available, and so a lot of the jays kind of pieced out of those campground areas. Hopefully that helps. So what does all of this mean? I think it means that management efforts that are aimed at changing human behavior, when we use them in tandem with food management and policy enforcement, and we really make it easy for people to follow these rules, that can actually work to reduce densities of subsidized species. The caveat is that it's not a magic bullet. Jays were still eating quite a bit of human food, even in that post-management period. So 47% of their diet was still human food. So there's still some work to be done here. And I don't know that you're ever going to completely eliminate subsidies, but it still reduced the density of jays in this area. And for marbled murrelets, that's likely a really big win. We know that jays forage kind of randomly. They don't really have a specialized search strategy looking for nests. It's just if they happen to run into a nest, they'll eat one. And so luckily, lower jay density really likely reduces the probability of jays coming into contact with and predating murrelet nests. So from the perspective of a marbled murrelet, this is probably a really big conservation win. And I think even beyond just Steller's jays and marbled murrelets and old growth redwood forests and the West Coast, this work has really broad applications. Human food subsidies are global. They can affect basically every aspect of species ecology. They can affect human-wildlife interactions. They're a really big deal. And this work shows that visitor education can be part of the solution to support protected areas' kind of dual mandate to provide the public with recreational opportunities and also to protect biodiversity. And yeah, I mean, I think this can be part of a strategy to make recreation and conservation more compatible. And then lastly, maybe the really, really, really cool thing is that it's not just going to work for Steller's jays in protected areas. Strategies like this can help solve a lot of other conservation and spillover predation and human-wildlife conflict issues. So yeah, I think that's pretty much all I have. With that, I would love to take any questions that have accrued. And yeah, I'd love to stop talking for a second.
Yeah, Kristin, that was so fun. I'm gonna unpin your video here. And this is the point where the crowd goes wild. Round of applause. Yeah, the virtual vibes are good. There's lots of love coming in from the comments right now. And just a really fun, interesting presentation. I know there's a couple folks asking about how the fires are impacting the marbled murrelet. Stephen and Alex both kind of have questions along those lines. But yeah, human fires, murrelets, how's that going?
Yeah, that is a really good, I guess I'm gonna stop sharing my screen so that we can just chat. Fires are a really big deal for murrelets. Specifically, I mean, I always feel funny giving presentations about Big Basin now because a lot of you probably already know Big Basin burned really badly last summer during the fire season. And so The last report I heard is that over half of the like really good merlet nesting trees actually were killed during the fire. So merlet nesting is not looking great at Big Basin. Kind of on the other flip side of that, there actually was a merlet nest found this summer in Big Basin, and several folks were actually there and watched the juvenile fledge and fly to the ocean, which is really, really cool. And I think just really speaks to the resilience of species like this. It's tough because redwood forests are fire adapted, you know, like they are made to withstand fire. The redwoods themselves are usually really, really pro fire. The issue is the severity of fire. When it gets to be, I mean, we've done a lot of fire suppression in the area. And so these trees that are adapted to kind of moderate severity fires that are pretty regular are not adapted to these really, really high severity fires, or what we're calling mega fires. And so when the trees aren't adapted to it, they don't survive as well through fires like that. And that's definitely what ripped through Big Basin during the CZU lightning complex fire last year. So I guess good and bad news. The bad news is a lot of the trees haven't made it, but the good news is that birds are still using the trees that are there. But yeah.
Yeah, I think there's a note from Jessica saying that Big Basin is still burning. So I don't know what the note is on that, but
yeah, I think some of the fires burned like underground throughout the winter and now are starting to kind of flare back up as things are drying out.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah, it's wild.
That is tragic, really.
Mm-hmm.
I think I was just thinking how the marbled murrelet is kind of the salmon of the skies here, where they're tying all these different ecosystems together. And so if you take care of the salmon, you're taking care of the freshwater and the saltwater and the estuaries. Whereas if you take care of the murrelet, you're taking care of the redwood forests and the oceans. And so
cool. I had a slide that I just took out that did have, it had a picture of like all the characteristic old growth redwood species that the murrelet umbrella can sometimes protect, but I cut it. I should have kept it.
I had a question while other folks definitely add your questions into the comments. I was wondering if the snacks depicted in your amazing little animations, are those some favorite snacks of yours, or are they like, do Steller's Jays like grape jelly, or like what's the deal with your snack choices?
My observation is that Steller's Jays are not picky and they'll eat anything. They're so funny. They know when snack time is. Like they would know when noon hit, that was checkout time. So people were like packing up their campsites and leaving, and the Jays were like, oh, time to do a patrol of the campground, go check out what snacks were left. But yeah, I put some of my fave snacks in there. I'm a big Teddy Graham fan, not gonna lie. A huge fan.
We have, well, a shout out from Mom watching.
Oh, hey Mom.
Well done, kid. You love supportive parents. Allison is wondering if a murrelet nest is predated upon, will they lay another egg, or are they done until the next season?
Yeah, I mean, I think evidence shows that they will lay another egg. It will probably be a slightly smaller egg than the first egg, because that's a lot of energy. But yeah, they will, it seems like they will renest at least once. Mostly based, I don't know how much that's based on like observations of seeing them renest. It's really hard to study marbled murrelets. Like I said, they're really, really cryptic. So finding their nests usually requires going out to sea, catching birds that are on the ocean, putting a radio tag on the bird. And then once the bird flies inland, gets its nest, at that point, you have to usually use a small plane and fly around the redwood forest trying to get a fix on that radio tag. And then once you get an idea of where it is, then you send someone in on foot to try to pinpoint which tree the nest is in. And then at some point, maybe you climb the tree to try to find it. So anyway, finding murrelet nests is really, really hard. So a lot of the information that we have is from trying to observe these nests from the ground. And so a lot of the idea that they'll renest comes from just the timing of when they would have laid their first egg versus when it failed and when they think they laid a second egg. That was a really long-winded answer to a simple question, but yes, they will renest.
Just the fact that it sounds like it's a really tricky habitat or a tricky nest to keep an eye on. And
yeah,
like the video of the jerk Steller Jay getting in, like
Mhm.
finding the nest first and then like, stashing a little camera there to capture that moment, which tragedy.
Yeah.
Patrick is saying the Steller Jays are like raccoons with wings.
That's true.
Just
They're little garbage collectors.
little garbage collectors. Let's see. We have another good question. How many hours of educating humans does it take to significantly alter their behavior of leaving less junk food for the wildlife?
It's a really good question. And that is it's a way better question for a social scientist than it is for me. They would probably be able to give you a much better answer. My impression is that it depends a lot on the person. And some people are really tuned in. And you think that people using a state park are usually people who are really amenable to change once they have that new information that they need, to make a decision and say like, oh, okay, this is really important that I keep my food put away. And a lot of the campers I would talk to like knew what was up, or they were regulars and had been to Big Basin a bunch of times. And then there were other people who were just like completely clueless and didn't really care and usually left their food out. So I think it kind of just depends on the person. And Big Basin, I feel like their strategy is basically hit people with it a lot, like have the same messaging and not only telling people what to do, but telling them why to do it. And I think that makes a big difference too, is like, don't just tell people what to do. You have to tell them why it's important that they clean up all of those crumbs and why even one little crumb can affect the amount of babies that a Steller's jay can have in a year. So yeah, I guess a lot of messaging is better, and it's really in your face if you ever go, well, when Big Basin opens again after the fire has burned it, yeah, the messaging I'm sure will be back and is really, really in your face. It's really hard to miss. I know the first year I went, at least like visitors that were camping were required to watch a whole video about the Marbled Murrelet and the Steller's jay. And I think it was like a little 5-minute video, but it's kind of hard to miss after that, So some people are really into it and really excited about it. And, with everything else, some people are not as interested, but that's where the enforcement comes in, right? Those people still don't want to get fined. So usually you have to tell people and then maybe have a little bit of teeth behind it if you can.
The carrot and stick. It's a bummer that they're so cryptic, because like if people could see how cute these little birds are that are in these old growth forests, like
yep,
show yourselves little cuties, then everyone will care about you.
That's true.
Kind of thinking on the same lines of that, like thinking about the not getting people to not feed the wildlife. I've seen signs at like duck parks where it's like, okay, this is a tradition I have with my grandparents where we go feed the ducks. But the signs now say instead of bread, use like frozen peas instead. And so kind of like recognizing like if people are going to feed the wildlife, here's at least an alternative that's better for the ducks, better for the ecosystem.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I think people are willing to change if they know why they're doing it. And like, yeah, you have to try to make it as easy for them as you can.
Yeah, make it easy. Which it looks like they have good signage. And I like the crumb clean campground, alliterations. See it everywhere.
Oh yeah. Make it catchy too if you can.
Make it catchy. I love it. Stephen has an excellent question here. They are wondering, on a scale of 1 to 10, how stellar is a Steller jay?
Is this Stephen Thielking? It is, isn't it?
It is.
I knew it. Hey, Steve. I'm gonna go there like an 11.5 probably on a scale of 1 to 10. It's so funny. I went into this like, you get this idea that like Steller's jays are the bad guys and like the Marbled Murrelet is like this little underdog. And I'm not saying that's not true, but it's also really hard not to fall in love with a Steller's jay when you spend 3 summers observing their behavior and getting to know each individual and all of their little personality quirks. And it's not their fault. They're just doing what they do, they're wildlife. They are really good at eating human food. And like, who doesn't love a snack? They're very relatable. So
really, yeah.
Yeah, I think it's a little nuanced, Steller's jays are good guys too. We just need to figure out how to have a more healthy relationship with them.
Well, I like that you pointed out, like, it's their habitat too. So in the, don't want to necessarily remove them. Just, yeah, it's the humans. We can do better. So
yeah,
that's a hopeful note to end on. I think I'm going to give folks a little bit more time to add some more questions as I just go over just a couple Harbor WildWatch announcements. But first, thank you again so much for virtually joining us on the Science Social, which we do every month. We do have another presentation coming up in August featuring mussels and how we can use mussels to monitor water quality in the Puget Sound and Greater Salish Sea. And so, yeah, those creatures doing good work out there. We also have opened the Scansey Visitor Center, so you're welcome to come visit Harbor WildWatch and our awesome rockstar team of volunteers who are there working the touch tanks. We've got the sandbox up and running. Pretty soon we'll have our underwater camera figured out. There's some streaming issues going there, so if you have some tech advice, we'd happily take that. Yeah, so those the Scansey House is open Wednesdays through Sundays, 10 to 4, and on farmers markets days, the Thursdays we're open until 7. So bring your friends, bring your family, come say hi. We encourage people to wear masks indoors, as we still have vulnerable people in our networks. So keep people safe and protected, but come do that. We'll also be doing some in-person beach walks in August. So if you're not already subscribed to the Wild Side Weekly, you can get on that newsletter so you get first dibs on when those are happening. So we'll have that schedule promoted soon. We're picking some fun low tides and some fun beaches to, get that personal connection to our places so that as humans, we can keep taking those positive actions to make sure that we're doing good for this environment. And I'm peeking over to our comment thread over here to see if any lingering questions have popped in. It doesn't look like there have been any, but one more announcement for any scuba divers tuning in. We do have a rockfish survey happening on August 6th. We'll meet at Tacoma Scuba parking lot at 6 p.m. So if you're a diver, you're welcome to join to do some community science. That's a fun way to add a twist of science to your splash. And I just see some more love pouring in on the comments of good job, great job, you're amazing, nice answers, thank you. So while it's not that in-person good feel, I think we'll be getting back to that soon. But I don't think we could have hosted you from Wisconsin on a regular type thing. So I personally am thankful that technology let this little reconnect happen. And
yeah, this has been great. Thank you so much, Steve. I'm sad I'm not in Washington. All these events sound really, really cool.
Right? I'd love to give you like a high five or something.
I know. Hugs. I miss hugs someday. That'll be a thing.
Well, with that, thanks again to everybody who tuned in and asked questions and submitted your comments. We really appreciate that because it makes these lives worth doing. So for those of you tuning in, thank you so much, and we'll see you next month. Do you want any last parting words as we sign off here?
No, it's been fun. Thanks for having me.
Thank you for joining us. So I guess, yeah, with that, we encourage you all to learn, have fun.